Ceasefire or no ceasefire, Turkey's decision to change the military equation in Syria, to send fresh troops in to take on Kurdish forces there, just as the Kurds' American allies and protectors pull out, is a geopolitical game changer. But it's an extraordinarily complex story for journalists to unpick. The talk in the Western media, outlets like NBC, Euronews, The Washington Post, has been of Americans double-crossing the Kurds, Kurdish fears of a possible ethnic cleansing, even a looming genocide. The narrative that the Erdogan government in Ankara has tried to get out there, that Kurdish forces on its southern border pose a mortal threat, has been lost on the Western commentariat. President Erdogan's messaging is far better received at home, thanks in large part to domestic media outlets that learned long ago they criticize this government at their own peril. Even reporting or posting on this story online can be dangerous. Dozens of Turks have been arrested for doing just that. Our starting point this week is the Turkish-Syrian border. Throughout Syria's civil war, the country's borders have not changed, but the demographics within those borders have, drastically. When the war began in 2011, Syria's Kurdish minority was spread in pockets along the border with Turkey. Over the 8.5 years of fighting, Kurdish militias have gradually taken control of almost 400 kilometers of territory along that border. The Turkish government now looks at its southern frontier and sees potential enemies at the gates, what it calls a terror bloc at its border. It says it wants to turn that area into a safe zone, a place refugees currently in Turkey can relocate to in Syria.
The Turkish offensive has a lot to do specifically with Turkey's policy regarding this one Kurdish group known as People's Protection Units, that's also known as YPG. The YPG is an offshoot of another Kurdish group that is known as the PKK. The PKK is a designated terror entity, viewed as such not just by Turkey but United States and all other NATO allies. So this was Turkey's attempt to go after this group that not just Erdogan supporters but many Turks view as a sworn enemy of Turkey.
Starting from 2014, the Syrian Kurdish forces embarked on a project of establishing an autonomous Kurdish region. And from a Turkish point of view, that is the first step to establishing a Kurdish state along Turkey's border, which is very frightening to Turkey. So in the Turkish mind, Western media coverage of Turkey's military incursion, which is largely pro-Kurdish, is just the latest indication that the Western world does not understand Turkey's security concerns.
We conducted 4 interviews on the narratives driving the coverage of this story. 2 with Turkish academics based in Washington. Both are frequent critics of the Erdogan government, although one of them says the incursion into Syria is justifiable. We also spoke with an Iranian-American journalist working out of Istanbul for a British newspaper, and a journalist academic, an Iraqi Kurd, now based in Pennsylvania.
The Turkish government has really had a very monumental task crafting a narrative that would be convincing to the world public opinion and also to the international power circles. The narrative is really focused on fighting terrorism.
We said we would never allow a terror corridor to form on our border.
The other element of this narrative is really centered on the refugee crisis. Governments are really worried about another major influx of Syrian refugees into Europe.
Are you prepared for what might in fact be a massacre?
A senior presidential aide, Ms. Gülnur Aybet, was on CNN explaining why it is necessary for Turkey to launch this incursion.
This is not an operation against Syrian Kurds. The YPG is equal to the PKK, which is a terrorist organization.
But she was still not as effective as the Turkish government wished, because this is a part of a larger problem, and that problem is President Erdogan lost his credibility. And the rising Kurdish image in international media is making things even harder.
Well, you know, the Kurds they're good fighters. They're great people, and they have a lot of pride for their land and where they are.
They are seen as freedom fighters in the Western media. So I think it's making it very difficult for the Turkish government to convince the international community that this is a just war.
The thing is, northeast Syria was mostly stable until a couple weeks ago. Yeah, there was a little bit of trouble. There are some questions about the administration of northeast Syria, but it wasn't like an imminent crisis. And when you start a war like that, it becomes a sort of war of choice. And so I think the Turks are discovering what the Israelis discover every time they make an incursion into Gaza or Lebanon. When you launch a full-scale operation like this, and there's no imminent dire threat, the burden of kind of explaining it to the world is on you and not the people that you're at war with.
In its dealings with the international media, the Erdogan government is also dealing with a case of journalistic blowback. According to the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists, Turkey has jailed more media workers than any country on the planet. A failed coup 4 years ago accelerated a crackdown on journalism that was already well underway. The online space offers no real refuge. Dozens of Turks have been arrested for posting criticisms of this military operation.
Sosyal medyada Barış Pınarı Harekatı konusunda ülkemiz aleyhine faaliyet yürüten 129 kişi gözaltına alınmış.
And a Turkish government that has treated its own journalists unjustly says it is now failing to get a fair hearing from international media outlets that are suspicious of just about anything Ankara says or does.
The biggest challenge for Turkey is that because the limitations inside the country on freedom of expression and freedom of media are so severe, outside observers often dismiss any story that comes out Turkey as spin, as unreliable, as fabricated by the government.
Turkish correspondents, when they're on air, whenever they refer to the PKK or the YPG, they have to refer to it as a terrorist organization.
Terör örgütü PYD, PKK'ya...
Not just on the first reference, not just on the second reference,
terör örgütü PKK'nın...
but on every single reference.
Terör örgütü PKK, YPG'de hareket...
It's almost Soviet in that respect. And while the Turkish media outlets are very good at covering civilian casualties and suffering on the Turkish side in these counterattacks, they don't seem to be interested at all or able to report at all on the suffering of civilians on the other side. It doesn't seem like any of that is allowed into the broadcast media.
Then there's the online misinformation factor. Teyit is a fact-checking site based in Istanbul. Among the posts it has exposed as fake this past week, a video allegedly showing Kurds killed in Turkish airstrikes that was actually shot in Egypt 2 years ago. This video of missile attacks, again allegedly by Turkish forces, shot in Siberia in 2010. This military offensive is barely a week old, and the truth is already amongst the casualties. Between the restrictions on Turkish media, Ankara's crackdown on criticism online, the broad brush approach of the international media, regional news outlets at odds with each other, not to mention the age-old fog of war, what chance do audiences really have of understanding this story?
Given the fast pace of developments on the ground, the Western media jumps on stories and video footages without properly vetting them. Recently, there was an incident with the ABC News which ran a story.
This video obtained by ABC News appears to
about a Turkish assault on the Kurds using a video footage which turned out to have been shot in the United States last year, and the lack of credible coverage by international media, which is making even more difficult for the people who are trying to understand what is going on the ground.
The Syrian situation has been a very complicated story. It's not very easy to get it right. When it comes to the political actors, the coverage has not been really even, but I think the focus on the civilian aspect is really what counts here. It's about telling the stories of those human beings on the ground and what is happening to them.
The more Erdogan cracks down on media, the more Turkey loses the narrative. We have to be honest about this. That is because the people look at Turkey as a quote-unquote autocratic regime, and therefore they dismiss any information coming out of Turkey as spin and propaganda. So if Turkey wants to regain the narrative regarding the PKK and the broader Kurdish issue, it is in Turkey's interests to have a free and flourishing media.